for being here. Great to have you. As I was saying to the few people who came in a little earlier, the recordings for previous sessions in this series are available on our YouTube channel. Dr. Barker's been kind enough to make those available for us. So if you are interested in learning about AI, about election myths and disinformation, about news deserts, about social media panics, and soon if you would like to share this information about the vertical video era of news, you'll be able to access that soon as well. So thanks to Dr. Barker from Bradley University for conducting these sessions, and I will give it over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you all for being here. If this is your first session or you're returning with us. So yeah, today we are going to talk a little bit about the transition of news to vertical video, right? Which is essentially, of course, just looking at video primarily on your phone vertically, right? And we're going to go through primarily TikTok because that's obviously the biggest one. But a lot of these approaches that we're going to look at from how news companies and individual journalists are doing vertical video also applies to Instagram Reels, which is Instagram's competitor to TikTok, and YouTube Shorts, which is YouTube's competitor to TikTok. So essentially, there are three major platforms for this type of short form vertical video that is used to create and distribute all sorts of media information that news companies are, of course, trying to get into that mix and figure out how they reach people in those spaces. So we'll go through some big picture information here and then just look at a bunch of different approaches that journalists and news companies are doing, talk about some of the complications, challenges that exist with, putting journalistic content on a platform like TikTok. And, if anybody has questions as we go through or comments, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. So just some basic info here, right? The widespread use of this device, a smartphone in any type, has led to a massive growth in vertically oriented media information. Because so much of our time is spent on these devices, most products, information, etc., that gets produced for these devices is thinking more vertically than horizontally, right? Generally, across studies, users across ages report higher levels of recall, of engagement, of interest in video that is vertically oriented. So that crosses advertising, that crosses news, that crosses just general media consumption. So if you're looking at things on your phone, the general preference seems to be that vertical video is better, right? Because it fills up more of the screen. It's not scrunched in the same way that horizontal video going this way might be. So if you're a news company, you have to consider, okay, these are growing consumer preferences. Studies show that consumers seem to, respond and recall information and feel generally more engaged with this type of video, but also with, how much time do we have to commit to vertical video? Do we have people that we can hire who are experts in shooting and producing this type of video? If we make videos that are horizontally oriented, do we set up the production, situation so that we can also then subsequently edit that video and make a vertical version too? So there are a lot more new questions that news companies have to think about in creating video that's more vertically oriented, right? So just to underline, where does this line up statistically? A study from Pew Research, which I tend to pull stuff from them pretty consistently. They do a lot of great cross-sectional research in America. From last fall, September 25th, October 1st of 2023, survey of, thousands of US adults. Where are you getting news, and sort of breaking that down demographically? the big takeaway from this was the percentage of people who are now using TikTok specifically to get news. So you can see here on the right, the growth overall across all ages from 2020 to 2023, still only 14% of US adults in aggregate who say they get their news from TikTok. But of course, when you look at that demographically by age, the numbers are very different. So folks 18 to 29, our growth has been from 9 to 32% in 3.5, 4 years. 30 to 49, we're looking at 2 to 15, 50 to 64, 1 to 7, 65 plus, less than 1% to 3%. So across age demographics or age brackets, growth, right? Obviously, the biggest growth, the most frequency or heaviest uses of young people, but across ages, more people are using TikTok to get news than they were previously. And one of the other parts of this survey was, and I think I showed it in our social media session, was just what social media sites do you use to get news in general, right? The graphs for every other major social platform, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Snapchat, their arrow is going down, right? YouTube is sort of flat or maybe slight growth, but outside of TikTok, the consumption of news on social media has gone down over the last 3 or 4 years. So a lot of that consumption is going here. I will ask before we move on any further, does anyone use TikTok? No. Okay, that's great. So we'll learn a little bit about it. We'll talk about how news companies are using it. I wanted to make sure before I got too deep into this. So yes, of course.
Isn't there a political movement towards anti-Chinese sentiment and them being able to influence the TikTok?
Yeah, so there's concerns across the United States from politicians across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, and among some citizens, especially folks outside of the 18 to 29 demographic, people who don't use it as regularly, that yes, because of the company that owns TikTok, which is called ByteDance, there are concerns about their relationship to the Chinese government, and therefore, if US citizens are using TikTok so regularly, what complications might exist as far as data collection, privacy, potential persuasion or mis and disinformation. And that's where, and we'll talk a little bit about this at the end, there's been the bill that's been passed and signed by President Biden to ban TikTok if they don't come up with a plan to sell it to a US-based company. So those concerns do exist. A lot of those concerns are obviously present with the social media companies that are owned by American citizens too, right? It's not as if the Facebooks and the Twitters of the world don't collect a whole lot of information on us and are full of mis and disinformation. But the international component and the US's sort of fraught relationship with China at the moment does make that a little bit more complicated. I wanted to just add a little bit of context here, just to think about, the broader impacts of this. We talked about this in our social media conversation as well. Not directly related to this, but recent research of specifically younger people, so even younger than that 18 to 29, thinking about how teens 13 to 17 who are part of this pretty extensive qualitative interview focus group research study from folks at a few different institutions found that, as you can see from the headline, teens see social media algorithms as accurate reflections of themselves and sort of the world. And this is not an effort to, underline that young people don't know how the world works or that they're deeply manipulated by the things that they're seeing online, but just to say, we have a population of people who are using platforms like TikTok really, really heavily. And there is, at least in certain studies, a reaffirmation of what they're seeing at least aligns with how they view the world. Whether or not they believe everything they see on those platforms is, a separate point. The survey found that these same teens, when they see things that they disagree with or they don't like, they just ignore it immediately. So if they see a TikTok video generally that they distrust, right, or they don't think is relevant to their personal interest, they just stop watching it and swipe to the next one, right? So young people in particular are using these things, but it crosses age brackets here. And there's certainly a sense of kind of reflecting of what people see on these platforms. So for news companies, then there's a sense we have to try to figure out, how does this work? How do we get into these spaces? How do we use these platforms in a way that appeals, especially to younger people, since they're heavy users? Research from the Press Gazette, which is a news source that focuses on the news industry and the media industry. They did this really good in-depth profile of the Daily Mail, which is a UK publication that has a US-based website that does really well in general. And they found that the Daily Mail is the second largest of kind of main news publishers on TikTok. The largest is actually this UK-based publication called Lad Bible, which you can guess sort of a men's, culture and media oriented news publication. That's not the hardest of news companies, I would say. They're not covering, things in a super in-depth reporting context. They post a lot of memes, quote unquote, funny videos, etc. That one, Lad Bible, actually has almost 13 million followers on TikTok. Daily Mail, which mixes different types of news content, we'll talk about that, 6.7 million followers. Sky News, 5 million. And then you see a bunch of kind of big US media companies, ABC, NBC, and Insider, somewhere between 4.5 and 3 million followers. Some different global companies, but a lot of just familiar companies. Today's Show is on there, MSNBC, the Washington Post, the New York Times is over here at 506,000. So what's notable is that a lot of the companies that do well already have like a big video component, right? So if you're thinking ABC News, NBC News, CNN, right, BBC, they're cable or broadcast companies. So they're already creating a lot of video that enables them to reuse that video on this video-oriented platform. Whereas if you're, something like the Wall Street Journal or the LA Times or the New York Times, you're certainly doing video for all sorts of older platforms, YouTube, Facebook, etc. But video is maybe not your primary output in news in the way that it is for ABC or NBC, which obviously have websites, have radio stations, satellite radio, all that stuff. But primarily they're doing video just on broadcast or cable. So some of these companies have tons of followers. Some of them don't have as many followers. For instance, the Washington Post, which is kind of in the bottom fourth here on the left-hand side. I think they have around 1.8 million followers now, but their videos get tons of likes, right? So one of the things that's really intuitive and I think palpable to people who use a platform like TikTok is that it has this really powerful algorithmic recommendation system that you're just seeing tons and tons of videos that you can swipe through, and you don't even have to follow the accounts to see them. It's all based on, your previous habits, which is true across all social media. But the sense among users is that the TikTok recommendation algorithm is just really, really sharp at guessing what you like and what you might like. So you encounter videos, for instance, from the Washington Post, which we'll talk more about, that get a lot of likes, but you don't even have to follow them to see them pretty regularly, right? So what I want to do now, if I can pause these since they're autoplaying, is talk a little bit about the different approaches that I see news companies taking on TikTok. And a lot of these are, again, just being reposted on YouTube, YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels. So the first one is the repurposing of videos that are basically airing or being broadcast or being posted elsewhere. And again, this is the primary approach of your ABC Newses of the world, BBC, NBC, those companies that are just producing a lot of video content already. They're just happening now to move it over to this vertically oriented space, right? So this is where we see examples of broadcasters posting segments, just full segments straight from TV, a few moments or a few hours, or even simultaneously after they air on television. And in fact, despite the, obsession with vertical video, a lot of these videos that the ABCs and NBCs of the world are posting on their account are actually just full-on horizontal videos that are clearly just, we're lifting the file from, our Good Morning America feed and just posting it on TikTok. And they still do get quite a bit of views and engagement. But I find that really interesting that all the focus, all the advice is on, it's got to be vertical video. And then they're posting these kind of squished, kind of blurry because it's squished videos from, the nightly news or Good Morning America, and people are still watching them here. So let me see if I can play this. It's going to jump out there. No, that's not the one. See, that's one of the problems with TikTok, is it just starts auto playing all the time. Let me pop back here into our full screen. There we go. Okay. Present. Okay. So here's a video from a couple days ago.
Very closely. The TSA expects to screen 18 million travelers from Friday into next Wednesday. Jacqueline Lee is joining us from LAX with more. Jacqueline, good morning.
Well, good morning to you. It has been moving all morning long here at LAX. The line's really backing up over at check-in. Now, TSA says they do expect this summer to be one of.
So I'm going to mute that while it plays, but you can see it's just a segment from GMA. I watch GMA most mornings. I saw this segment, at 7:20 a.m. the other day, right before Memorial Day weekend. And you can see how small that horizontal video is. But to some extent, I think they're beyond the efficiency of reusing content, and putting it in a new platform. There's a sense of the credibility that comes with, seeing the presentation of this coming straight from television, right? So that if you encounter this on TikTok, this looks like a professionally produced news segment that you would see on broadcast television, tons of interviews on location, camera work and reporting, cutting back and forth between the anchor and the reporter who's live at the airport, right? That, I think, does enable these videos to have a little bit of credibility that maybe makes up for the fact that they kind of look like crap, right? I mean, if you're looking at this on your phone, you can imagine how pinched and squished that horizontal video is. But if you look at ABC News's account, most of them are like that, right? Despite the fact that the platform is supposed to be all about, vertical video. If I go over here, a similar one from NBC, you can see it actually jumps out back and forth.
That's true.
Right now, if you're encouraging me to take one of these drives right now, if you need a new flavor, sometimes you take one of these drives.
Putting it into Schedule 4, the concept, the goal is to keep the pills from being able to be provided to people that aren't.
So this is about a decision in Louisiana to classify certain abortion medications to the sort of dangerous drugs list. And what's interesting here is they clearly thought about how this would play across different platforms more than the ABC News version. So you can see here when we have the interview with the politician from Louisiana, it's closing in on their faces. And when it cuts back a couple of times here we've got a longer horizontal video, then we're coming in, then back to more of a horizontal video with the bars over the top. Here, notably, oh, I hate when it does that. Okay, so it shows you the next video. They've stacked the same image essentially on top of each other, where you see a little bit of a close-up of the other politician being interviewed, and then the bottom half of that image is the politician and the journalist from the same spot, as you can see here. So they filled the frame with two horizontal images stacked on top of one another. So I find this to be a really interesting approach, one that's kind of disorienting at first if you haven't seen these types of videos over and over again. but they're trying to find different ways to reuse material that was clearly shot for television, clearly shot for broadcast horizontally. But, you know, if you shoot with a horizontal conventional broadcast video camera, you should give yourself enough space that when you want to do a close-up, you can edit that frame down into a vertical edit there. But this is one approach, repurposing videos from other channels on TikTok. Any thoughts or responses to that? Good, bad? It's a great question. So the way the ads usually work is when you swipe through. So TikTok works vertically like that entirely. And you watch a video, and then when you're done with it, you swipe up. And then as you're swiping, the next, you know, you see 2 videos, and then the third one is an ad, right? And then you see another video, and it's all based on that swipe. Yeah. So it doesn't have the same, like if you think about YouTube where there's like a 20-second autoplay before you watch a video, TikTok is different in that you're just swiping, and, you know, 2 out of every 5 videos you swipe through ads. Yeah.
Source of income, or they're just trying to get to an audience.
Yeah, so that's one thing that we're going to talk about here is how do they view this? And I think more generally, they're viewing it in, to your second point, which is they're viewing it as how do we grow an audience, because they are not making money off of the ads in the same way that you even do on YouTube, where you can get a cut of the ads that air before or run before your videos. So second approach, sharing videos from people who were at events, right? Which this, again, is not an approach that exists exclusively on social media. Like television news has been doing this for ages. People who are at live events or tragedies or horrible things that are happening, you see those on the local news all the time that are not shot by the journalists. News companies do a lot of this too, sharing cell phone videos that are often shot vertically, because most people are holding their phones like this when they're recording, that provide that type of on-the-ground view. And sometimes these videos then get edited together with additional information, adding text over it to explain what you're seeing in the video. Sometimes they edit 2 or 3 different feeds of, you know, individual citizens' videos together. Sometimes they mix that with journalistic video. In certain cases, they might do a voiceover over the top of that video. So if we look at this first example here from the Wall Street Journal, this is a brief video about Jerry Seinfeld's graduation speech at Duke. That was, you know, moderately controversial. A few students walked out, etc. So you can see what this looks like and how they're putting together different types of material into one TikTok video. Wall Street Journal didn't have journalists like on the ground at this graduation, but they're now creating something after the fact.
Dozens of students walked out of Duke University's graduation ceremony to protest its commencement speaker, Jerry Seinfeld. The students opposed the comedian's support for Israel throughout the war in Gaza.
I totally admire the ambitions of your generation to create a more just and inclusive society. I think it is also wonderful that you care so much about not hurting other people's feelings. It's lovely to want to fix those things, but, all caps, but, what I need to tell you as a comedian, do not lose your sense of humor.
Pro-Palestinian demonstrations also took place at UC Berkeley's commencement ceremony. Student protesters have called on universities to divest themselves of investments in companies doing business with Israel.
So you can see, very short video, there is the establishing video of Seinfeld talking, then cutting to the audience, a few students walking out in protest, not necessarily of Seinfeld, but of, you know, of folks who are protesting, you know, in investment in, you know, Israeli sources of income and support, right, in the rising protests related to Israel and Palestine. That video of the students walking out was shot by other students, so came from other students' TikTok videos or social media videos. The Seinfeld video came from, you know, Duke officially and was sort of edited by the Associated Press. And then the journalist has put a little voiceover on the top of it, right? So multiple sources coming together in what is, a 25-second video. Same thing here in this New York Times TikTok, which is just quickly reporting on some storm damage from last week.
We thought we lost our house, but we were lucky. It's kind of weird seeing all this trash when yesterday I was driving through here and everything was sunshiny and fine. You never ever think it's going to happen to you. And then it happens to you. It's just crazy to see your hometown like this.
So a very quick, simple video relaying what's happened. You see the early clip is of the tornado, right? Then we cut to a few shots of damage and then the quick stand-up interview with one of the residents. Really quickly, or very briefly, I should say, in the bottom left corner, text appeared and said, images or video courtesy of the Associated Press. So for, over 100 years, news sources have been using Associated Press work. They pay license fees to, use Associated Press stories in local papers. The AP fills that void in a video and audio context too. They still have reporters all over the country. When things like this happen in Iowa, the New York Times doesn't typically have reporters in Iowa unless there's a major, sort of sporting event or the caucus happening there, right? So New York Times has taken video from the Associated Press that they pay for the license for. They've put, the credit in the video, and then they've just added some New York Times branding and text over the top of it. No voiceover there, in contrast to the Wall Street Journal video. The first clip that we saw of the tornado touching down was obviously just shot by a person in their backyard or in their car, right? So that's another approach, mixing together different types of video to present people, on the ground views, but you're still, crediting who's ever shot that video, putting those things together. And then depending on the situation, maybe you're adding a bunch of different context, or maybe you're not, like the New York Times video, pretty much just putting together audio and video from other sources. Okay. So then here's another approach. This is where we're getting into sort of more creative forms of what this can look like. And this is an approach that I would say focuses way more on original reporting, featuring journalists either on camera, in frame, or hearing their voices. That's way less of we're just reusing stuff from other people, right? Whether that's other journalists or people who were on the ground during a storm event. So this is where, especially a lot of the larger companies, the Times, the Wall Street Journal, are trying to push further into the TikTok realm to figure out, okay, what can we actually do on TikTok that features our journalists, that features our reporters, and helps us, market or brand it specifically as the New York Times, right? So these are going to mix different types of media. You might see these kind of stand-up interviews that we're seeing here. You still might see clips, voiceovers, text appearing, captions. So there's a lot more going on here. These videos are often longer. I believe that the max right now for a TikTok video is 10 minutes, and they're experimenting with 15. When TikTok first, kind of made it over here to the United States, it was much shorter, but to encourage more engagement, longer time spent on the platform, therefore, seeing more ads, and trying to, just market the amount of time and amount of minutes that people are spending on the platform, they have expanded the option to make much longer videos. So instead of it being 45 seconds or a minute, there are videos that are posted on here that are 9 minutes long now, which is a huge switch from just a few years ago. So we can see what these look like. I'll show you the Wall Street Journal one because it's already done. The New York Times one was still going. So that video is like more than 2 or 3 minutes long. So this is a Wall Street Journal story about Zen, which is the what's the word? I'm trying to think. Well, I'll just play the video. Yes, but it doesn't, it's missing a component that allegedly makes it less addictive. Obviously, I need to watch the video because I don't know enough about
These
the product.
fine pouches may be the future of the tobacco industry, but there's no tobacco
There we go. I
Inside.
couldn't remember
The
which thing
main
was on there.
ingredient inside Zins is pure nicotine.
These are Zyn nicotine pouches. You may have seen them for sale at convenience stores, gas stations, and even your local pharmacy, or on social media, where they've birthed a devoted subculture.
Good morning, boys. Hello.
Over the past year, sales of Zyn have skyrocketed.
Zyn is definitely having a moment.
Senator Chuck Schumer called for a federal crackdown on the pouches. This scrutiny has in turn triggered another chapter in America's culture war, with some on the right declaring a Zinsurrection. Senator Tom Tillis responded on X with a message that said, "Come and take it, Chuck." Fueling Zyn's rise are self-styled Zinfluencers who feature the nicotine pouches in their social media content.
Upper Ducky gum, Billy's Upper Ducky lip cushions.
Unlike cigarette brands, nicotine pouch brands are permitted to advertise on billboards and television. Philip Morris said it has reached out to social media influencers, asking them not to promote Zyn in any form where the audience includes people under 21. According to the FDA, nicotine is addictive, but by itself, it doesn't cause cancer or lung disease. If the agency does authorize a nicotine pouch, the authorization might come with marketing and flavor restrictions.
So in that video, we get more of a conventional reporter voiceover explaining the story, introducing a lead, walking us through a couple of the key points. It's still relatively quick. A mix of different components. There's, B-roll of convenience stores with the Zyn on the shelves. There's multiple quick clips from influencers who are using these products. We get the quick photo or very, very brief video of Chuck Schumer holding it up at some press conference. Then we get the screenshots of the social media replies to Chuck Schumer from folks in the Republican Party. So a lot of things in the mix in what is a 45-second video. But this is a little bit more of, an original report on a trend that's happening in culture. The same sort of idea with a little bit higher production value is happening with this New York Times video, which is, they've done extensive videos, unsurprisingly, in covering Donald Trump's trial that's just about to wrap up in Manhattan.
That there is an enemy.
So this is a reporter
that he is fighting for real America against the enemy. A trial fits perfectly into that persecution narrative. The narrative being, this isn't just an attack on me, this is an attack on you, my supporters.
They're not after me, they're after you, and I just happen to be standing in the way, but I always will.
Those are the terms in which Trump has framed this battle, and they're terms that have been accepted by many millions of Republican voters.
Really inherently attack all his supporters. As Donald Trump very eloquently says, when they're coming after him, they're really looking to come after us.
So we don't know how this is all going to shake out. What we can say empirically is that the felony charges themselves were rocket fuel for Donald Trump's campaign up until this point.
So I'm just going to mute it there and play the first few seconds of the video so you can see how it's introduced. So introduced using kind of the very conventional New York Times branding, the same font that you see online. The reporter gets clearly introduced. They even label this as the type of story that it is. So this is an analysis story, which mixes reporting and, perspective. They don't like to call it opinion because they have a third section that they call opinion, right? But they're clearly trying to label this is what type of thing you're seeing on other videos that are just conventional reporting. It says, news, or it says sports, or it says politics, right? So they're making more of an effort to be clear about what type of video you're seeing. The New York Times is also making way more of an effort to put the journalist in the frame, right? And this is a more of a professional production. This is clearly shot in a studio against a gray background, relatively, close-up shot of Jonathan Swan, the reporter who's been covering Trump for years now. So instead of just a voiceover where you hear a disembodied voice of a journalist or just somebody who works for the company, way more attention is paid on this is the reporter, this is the expert, this is the person who's talking about this, intercut with all these other pieces of media, whether it's cable news interviews, still shots, graphs, things like that are moving, but making way more of an effort to show you who is the reporter here. Any thoughts about these types? Yeah.
So people that are watching this, what if they want to know more? Is there anything in this display that?
Yep.
Say, if you want to know more, do
Yep.
this.
Yeah, so one of the things that we see less of here, and I can actually pop that out, is there is a caption. So if I go here
Know what the verdict is going.
and go away, it's trying to pop up. So there are captions. In certain cases, they'll do this, which is just, you know, a sort of simple caption, credits of who did it using hashtags. In other cases, news sources or journalists will put a link there. It's still not the easiest navigation, right, to use the links in that way. But there is an opportunity to be able to get people to click through. It just requires them to leave the app, which is a thing that people often don't want to do, right? Which goes back to your prior point, and I've got more of that later in the presentation as far as like, well, what is the purpose of this then, right? Like if you're not, as a news company, making money off the ads that are randomly appearing before these videos, and it's hard for people to go from here to your actual website where you're going to maybe paywall them or ask them for a subscription or a donation or to see more ads, what is the monetary value of being in this space, right? It's a great question. Any other thoughts on these types of videos? Do we find these more credible or more interesting than the ones that we've seen in the previous two categories? Or you're still looking at these thinking like, I don't care about this. Why would I watch it?
Yeah, that looks more attractive,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking if I was filming a panel discussion, are we gonna pan across the whole, you know?
Yeah, and that's a great example. The Wall Street Journal, a lot of their recent videos, I actually had to go down pretty far. They've had a couple of, you know, all the big news companies do live events and sort of panels and that sort of thing. And they do now, when they're shooting those events, they're making sure that people are framed in such a way that they can chop it up and turn it into vertical video. So a lot of what is on the Wall Street Journal's account in the last couple of weeks are 30-second snippets from these live events. So they are framing those things with that in mind, but obviously there's not the live component that you can get even on a platform like Facebook, which allows you to go live, or YouTube or whatever. You know, these are all being posted like after the fact. You can post really quickly, but you're not live in the same way that you can be on other spaces. Any other thoughts? I've got a couple other approaches. So these are still pretty familiar. So one of the things that I would say that is really popular in a space like YouTube or on TikTok and YouTube Shorts, and it's become popular, or it's been popular on other social platforms. If you look at, you know, a decade's worth of advice for journalists and news companies on how to get attention and build an audience on social media, there's so much about be more transparent, show more about your process, explain how you did this story, the people that you talk to, as long as, you know, you're not revealing people's protected identities or whatever. If you work in a newsroom, right, show more of what's going on in your newsroom so your audience kind of gets to know who you are. And that the logic goes that builds trust, right? That people in a world where there's extreme distrust of journalists and news companies, the advice is often use social media to kind of let people in, right? That's one of the things that social media influencers, YouTubers, just general content creators, that's what they do on these spaces, and that's how they build a relationship that they can then monetize. So news companies and journalists have tried that for various degrees of success. One of the things that you see a lot of on TikTok is individual journalists who are, you know, trying to build a brand or build a career for themselves, using the platform to explain the work that they've already done, right? So their story goes live on the website, then they might post a TikTok video explaining the story, talking about the primary subjects in the story, talking about why the story is important. essentially retelling the story, but for this TikTok audience who is probably not going to go to WashingtonPost.com to read it, right? And if you're an individual journalist, you obviously care about people reading your story, but it's less of your individual concern how many views your story gets on WashingtonPost.com than it is for like the bosses of the Washington Post, right? And maybe you're going to eventually leave the Washington Post or need to get another job. This is a way for you to build a platform for yourself. So the first video here on the left is from Taylor Lorenz, who's a really great, influential journalist in the realm of online culture, YouTube, social media. She's worked for The Atlantic, The New York Times, and is now at the Washington Post. So she's pretty smart about how to use these platforms. And here's an example of, what these videos might look like. She's written a story. It's on the Washington Post website. It's in the paper. Now she's going to talk about it for the TikTok audience.
YouTube CEO said basically people are now watching YouTube videos the way that they used to sit down and watch television shows. He also said that globally, viewers now watch more than 1 billion hours on average of YouTube content on their TV every day. He also said that YouTube, when you compare it to other streaming platforms, is actually the leader in streaming watch time for the past 11 months. But these changes in viewer consumption patterns has actually led creators to think really differently about the content that they produce, with an increasing number now considering how to optimize their content for a living room experience.
So if you see at the top left, there's a pink bar going to the right. That's the progress of the video. So you can see we've got a while here. But behind her, if you look at the top of her head, there's a feathering effect happening there because she's using a green screen, right? She's got a green screen behind her. And so she's now throwing things up behind her, including right above her head are screenshots of her story and certain things highlighted that she's now talking about, right? And that's one of the most popular features of TikTok in general, is using this type of green screen effect, both digital green screen, like if you've ever been in a Zoom meeting or Google Hangouts where you can blur your background, it's doing that sort of digital effect and then placing something over it. And then more high profile content creators or people on TikTok, they get like a literal screen that they put behind them, right? To make that effect even better when they're producing these videos. But this is a great example of journalists did all this reporting. You can see the text version of the story. She'll tell them, go to the link in my bio to get to my page on the Washington Post. But she's spending 3, 5, 9 minutes, like basically just telling you the whole story here. You're seeing the headline, she's even pointing to it, right? So in this case, it's a little bit more of promotion for yourself, explaining the story in a different way, just talking casually to the audience. But, this video feels faster paced than the New York Times video we just saw. You can tell she's just sitting in her apartment. She's talking quicker. She's talking more with her hands. She is more of the type of person who puts content on TikTok than the previous journalist who we saw, who was doing a very conventional, video that could frankly be anywhere. It just happens to be vertically video and put on TikTok, right? So that's one example. And individual journalists are doing a lot of this, right? And a lot of that is responding to what regular people who use TikTok do, right? And we'll get to this at the very end, but one of the things that journalists and news companies are having to reckon with in this space is obviously you write a story, it goes online. What a lot of people build their following on TikTok with is using that green screen effect, putting someone else's story behind them and then critiquing it or talking about it, right? So all the reporting has been done by somebody else, and then a second, a third, 100th person is coming in and just talking about it, right? So if you're a journalist, there's pressure to, I guess I have to be in this space and talk about my story because other people are. The other thing that happens, which again, this is not new to TikTok, but just there's an effort to let's show the newsroom, and that can be sort of serious. Here's how we did this story, but also kind of fun behind the scenes videos that you might see from the newsroom. So this is one from the Indy Star, and they just put I don't know why they did this. I don't know if there was like a viral burger, but they gave a bunch of people who work in the newsroom a cheeseburger that had peanut butter on it and basically asked them to react in real time.
There is a strange combination of where, yes, I'm enjoying a cheeseburger and, oh yeah, there's peanut butter on here too, so.
Ooh, yeah, that's what I'm being. You know, it's good. It's
Okay, we get it, but there's a lot of these type of videos too that are intended to be, that fit right into the TikTok framework, right? Short, food-based videos, things that have light attempts at humor, but are an effort to, from the indie star standpoint, to get you to stop and pay attention, to potentially follow, to get to know some of the folks who work in the newsroom. So you want to kind of come back and see the other things they're posting. But this is an effort to be more transparent, right? Last category, and then we'll talk about some of the challenges here. So the last one is the most creative, the most that's an effort to fit into the platform dynamics and how TikTok actually works. No. Well, that was convenient. These are an effort to mix comedy and news together. And sometimes they involve costumes, sometimes they involve characters, as you saw in the video briefly there on the left. Sometimes they involve puppets. And these are all from like serious news companies. I want to say here, these are not just random individual creators. And these are clearly way more of an effort to appeal to people who use TikTok really strongly. So if I can play this first one here, I don't know why it's not letting me. That's so annoying.
now, if you want to buy spirit.
This one specifically like won't play. That's so odd. Well, that one features, that's from the LA Times, and it features a puppet who they use in a lot of their stories. So this one is about the increase of electric cars, and the main journalist in the story is this puppet, and he has a name that I've forgotten now, but he goes out and he interviews people. You can see he's sort of sitting at a replica desk here. You're seeing that video put behind him. We're seeing his, cartoon, or not his cartoon, his cardboard box car as he's driving down the street. All sorts of different things happening here. This is obviously trying to be a basic form of funny, right? I put comedy in scare quotes there. I show these to my college students all the time, and they often respond very positively to them. And I think that's where we're starting to see the generational differences, because I immediately want to turn them off, right? And then here is a video from the Washington Post, which has gotten the most, attention, respect, credibility for their TikTok videos. They actually started using TikTok even before the pandemic, which is when TikTok really exploded here in the United States. So dating back to 2019, and they do a lot of these videos that are heavily news-based, but involve, major effects, lots of characters, lots of costumes. So this is one about JetBlue, a federal judge blocking JetBlue's efforts to merge with Spirit Airlines.
Spirit, when you enter a market, other airlines drop their pricing by 7 to 11%. But this merger would only hurt customers. We agree. But if we took the 6th and 7th largest airlines in the US and merged them, we'd be the 5th largest airline. We'd be a viable, long-term competitor to the dominant legacy.
So what they often do is take real stories, especially when they're involving like legal cases. They're reading real things that came in court, but they've got people wearing costumes. They've got, 2 or 3 people on staff, so they play like multiple roles in the same video. But these are an effort to, again, try to be funnier. I do not know why I want to click it.
Because young people are so used to being entertained.
I think that's where the theory comes from, right? I mean, when I talk to my students about these type of videos every semester, one of the things that came out recently was we were talking about the generational differences and how I don't like these videos, and they seem to, it feels very much like this era's version of something like The Daily Show, right? Where when I was in college, you know, all of the conversation about news was centered around like young people are watching The Daily Show, they're getting their news mixed with satire, with comedy. And does that mean that like they're not taking the news seriously? They're not being informed? I think a lot of these efforts that try to mix, again, comedy with news, characters, costumes, essentially trying to create, you know, viral memes out of news coverage. I think it's trying to attract, it's making a lot of assumptions about the audience that someone who's 19, who spends a lot of time every day swiping on this platform is never going to stop and watch one of that Good Morning America video, right? Unless it's about a topic that they actually care about. Whereas if they see a weird puppet doing comedy, if they see, you know, a sort of special effects in a video, they might stop a little bit.
Frankly, it comes across as kind of brainless.
Yeah, and from my perspective, is it also feels like pandering, right? It assumes that the audience will not pay attention to anything unless it's presented to them in the framework of a puppet or somebody wearing costumes, right? But the Washington Post, as I mentioned, almost 2 million followers on TikTok. Their videos have 86 or 87 million likes, which is a lot. And when you Google, you know, how should newsrooms use TikTok or how should journalists use TikTok, they always bring up the Washington Post, right? So even, you know, the platform is still young. Most big news companies, a lot of mid-sized news companies have jumped onto TikTok. But as in my experience, we see this with each platform. Companies see that people are using something, it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, now it's TikTok. So they immediately create an account, they put some resources, hire some people. They're trying to figure out, okay, how do we reach people in these spaces? Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And in a lot of cases, they just kind of stop posting there, right? Because they realize maybe it doesn't hold a lot of value for them, or it raises a bunch of questions about what are we even doing here? Like, if we're not getting subscriptions out of this, is it worth it? You know, the main person at the Washington Post, Dave Jorgensen, who's been doing this for a while, he does a lot of these interviews because journalists, other news companies are reaching out basically saying like, how do you do it? How do you make these videos that people like, allegedly, right? And he kind of talks about their logic and their process a lot. So I just wanted to show a little bit of that. So he said that at the Washington Post, they tend to try to upload a couple a day. This is from last year, I think, so, or maybe late 2022. So maybe that's increased. But between 12 and 6, and, you know, trying to catch people at different parts of the day, as well as where people are winding down in the UK. They have a lot of people who follow and like their videos from the UK. You'll notice that we very rarely take other footage, horizontal footage that even the Post shot and repurpose for TikTok, because they want very specifically to make it seem like it is an iPhone shot TikTok video, right? So unlike some of those other companies, they've made an effort to say no horizontal video and not even any repurposed video. We're going to create it new, which is how you end up with people wearing, you know, judges' robes and playing 3 characters and having a wig on or whatever. Yeah.
So they're saying that if somebody in a certain age group thinks this was made on an iPhone, it's more reliable? I
think that he's using iPhone as a filler for, or as a blanket term for smartphone. I would guess that 99% of the people who, you know, work on their crew are using an iPhone because of the high percentage of people who use iPhones, especially in creative industries. But I think he just means it as a filler word for vertically shot on a smartphone.
That's more believable.
Yeah. For the audience they're trying to appeal to. Yeah. In contrast to something that looks like the ABC News video that I showed, which is
your parents' video.
Correct. Yeah. That is maybe credible, the ABC News video, but it's boring, right? So you're going to swipe through. The interview or the story that did the really in-depth look at the Daily Mail, which creates a lot of different types of video, right? Daily Mail, you know, a lot of UK news organizations are a little bit more salacious, a little bit heightened, right? So their types of videos are news oriented, but there's a lot of like viral videos involving pets or like stupid criminals or celebrity coverage, right? Mixed with some harder reporting. But they talk to the folks at the Daily Mail and like, okay, how did you grow your account so quickly? And, you know, he said that they're doing, you know, TikTok explainers, which is more of the, you see the journalists, they're talking to you about a news article, the articles behind them. They're doing those 7 or 8 times a day. So their approach, because they're, you know, reusing material, they're doing a lot of front facing, someone's just talking. There's not costumes, there's not characters, etc. Their approach is we're just going to post as much as we can, right? Short, 7 to 8 times a day in just that category. And then they figured out that one of the things that does really well for them is going out into the city streets and just asking random people questions to get their opinion. And you can see one twist on that format was one of the Mail's producers walked around the streets of New York wearing a t-shirt of Donald Trump's mugshot the day after it was released. And they just like filmed the reactions of people, right? From my vantage point, kind of a weird thing to do journalistically, right? From an ethics standpoint, but you can see, you know, how when you're trying to gain attention in these spaces and you're the Daily Mail, which is not, you know, the most ethically centered news organization, you're willing to do that to capture attention. But 2 different approaches, you know, heavier production values, a few videos a day so you don't overwhelm the audience, to we're just posting a lot of stuff, right? Jorgensen from the Washington Post, that's him in 3 of those shorts. You can see in the second one, it's some story about lions in Kenya. And so he's made his head larger and he's like performing as a lion. Again, people say these videos are funny. I personally find them awful, but I'm just describing what's happening. He's talked about how in the last year, they started posting way more on YouTube Shorts, and they expanded their audience from like 6,000 subscribers to like 100,000 in just a couple of months, because YouTube is trying to compete with TikTok. So if you log on to YouTube, the Shorts tab is higher up on the app and on your web browser. So because YouTube is prioritizing Shorts more, the Washington Post has decided to do it to get more attention, right? So they're exploiting, in a positive way for them, the priorities of YouTube changing a little bit. What they also noted is that they don't really change much. So they try to do videos that are still relatively short, within a minute or 2. YouTube Shorts, I think, has a much smaller window for time length. I think they're still at 60 seconds. So he essentially they just repost the videos, right? So that allows you to reach slightly different audiences in new spaces. But to a couple of your points, as we get to the end here, companies have embraced these areas, these platforms, knowing that generally speaking, it's all about just being visible on these platforms and branding, not subscriptions. Notably, all Washington Post is amazing at it. They're finding a new audience. They've got all these likes. The same time that's been happening in the last 6 months to a year, they've laid off like 280 people. They lost $100 million last year, and they have sort of a crisis in their newsroom to figure out, what do we do, right? And there's been a lot of reporting about the Washington Post trying to figure out how they cover, how they cover news in a way that appeals to an audience that differentiates them from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Because if you want kind of a big national newspaper that covers a lot of different things, that still has a lot of journalists, most people are picking one of those 2 before they get to the Washington Post. So they're a little bit at a crossroads. But notably, having this big TikTok following and now this following on YouTube Shorts hasn't really done anything for them as far as getting people to pay for the news, right? Gets them a lot of likes, gets them articles, but that doesn't actually necessarily lead to people subscribing. Obviously, the goal is hoping down the road, if you're a 21-year-old or you have a 21-year-old who's watching a bunch of your videos day after day, year after year, that eventually you can convince them to click that, red subscribe button and pay for your news. I am extremely skeptical that that is the case when you've made this video content available to them for free for however long. And especially when you think about those videos versus how the Washington Post covers news generally. If you see the Washington Post only through TikTok, you see these people playing characters with costumes on, and then you say, man, I love that. I want to pay to support the Washington Post. Then you go to their website and it's just a bunch of text-based articles that are very serious news about what's happening in DC or around the world. Are you going to think like, wow, those two things are exactly the same? More likely, you're going to be like, are these even the same company? I don't understand what's happening here. So the branding, the visibility that you're gaining in social media, I don't know if that actually works, which I think, you know, that lends credence to the kind of Wall Street Journal, New York Times approach being a little bit more valuable, because at least when you go from TikTok to their website or their physical newspaper, it feels and looks and kind of sounds the same, right? Naturally, there's also anxiety in the industry. There's been some articles over the last couple of months about how much time do we spend on this platform, resources, hiring people, when there's a potential ban happening. There's, you know, a general skepticism about the ownership of TikTok, right? You know, general concerns about social media. And so that's a really interesting point of tension where these companies are, you know, constantly thinking or doing stories about how social media might not be the best thing for us, or the challenges or complications with social media. And then they're going on social media and creating content, right? Which I think is really interesting. The last thing here, I think from my perspective, you know, trying to create the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post style videos that try to look like TikToks, right? That if you just saw the video, you wouldn't necessarily know it's from the Washington Post. I think that does create some really ethical, it creates some questions about, you know, the lines between entertainment and journalism, or, you know, raises questions about reporting ethics. You know, so this is a video about when Iran launched an attack on Israel, and the way that he's sort of talking about the video and describing things. I just find it to be so glib in a way that deflates the circumstances.
And France is here to help. And France is here to help too. And here's fighter jet and a few fighter jets. We both lost a lot of resources, but 99% of the attacks from Iran were intercepted. So you're welcome, Israel. How do we respond, though? We're not going to help you if you attack Iran. Please do not escalate. Yes, we need to find a path to peace for the region.
So I think, you know, that is a video that got a lot of likes. People viewed it, but that, again, if you then went to Washington Post's actual reporting on their website about that event, would feel very different, right? So there's a flattening between, you know, when you see news and when you see content. What I think is really interesting, and then I'll open it up to questions, is now there's this trend, and there's multiple people who have a decent following, relatively speaking, doing this, where especially young people are building a social media profile by reading the news that they didn't report, that they didn't create, on TikTok, right? So this TikToker, Kelsey Russell, all she does is read the physical newspaper. She goes and she gets the Sunday Times, and then when she travels or goes other places, she gets papers from those communities. And she just literally opens up the physical newspaper and reads the story. And a bunch of young people follow her and talk about how cool it is to like get the news from her. Maybe she's encouraged some people to subscribe, which would be great, but you can see what this looks like.
Which is the paper, which is owned by Gannett, which produces USA Today. I try to leave my hands on an independent local news source. It was very difficult getting my timing. I'm gonna eat my meat back, through the paper, and tell you all what I found the most interesting. I would argue USA Today has some of the most digestible papers for anybody who's like just interested in reading the newspaper, who doesn't want to be overwhelmed by like complex terms. And they also have all these like fun facts. Like they usually have this section in this paper, Today in History, where it talks about things that have happened over time on the same day. Like this paper came out January 28th on Sunday. Like on this day in 1956, Elvis Presley made his first national TV appearance on Stage Show, a CBS program hosted by Tommy and Dewey Dorsey, the Steelmax. There is a book coming out about white Southern fraternity culture and drinking. I'm going to annotate and get back to you all.
So one of the things that she does is like highlight and annotate the story, and then read important parts, shows people the important parts in the story.
Who is reviewing the book Among the Bros, a fraternity crime story by Max Marshall. Part of my whole thing is media literacy, let's talk about.
And notice in this context, these videos, in contrast to a lot of things we've seen, these videos 8, 9, 10 minutes long, right? So they're using the platform capability a lot more. This is way more what videos look like on TikTok. But I find that to be a fascinating development. This is someone who clearly does care about the news, does care about media literacy, talks a lot about that, is shouting out the individual journalists and things like that, talking about the tactility of physical newspapers. But again, if you're a news company, you're like, that's cool. Thanks for shouting out our paper. Maybe that gets you a few more subscribers. But you see how even people who use TikTok to build a brand for themselves, and I don't mean that negatively, using physical newspapers, that is still something that doesn't quite actually benefit news companies and the folks who are actually doing the reporting. So I find that to be another fascinating wrinkle that underlines, news companies feel like they need to be in these spaces. They feel like they need to put resources towards it. But there are a lot of reasons that suggest to me that, it's never going to be a thing that gets people to subscribe, right? It's never going to be a thing that saves local news or, builds up subscriber bases, because that move from seeing a video on your phone to then actually paying to support the company, it's only 1 or 2 clicks, but the distance between those clicks is really, really far. So happy to answer any other questions or comments, but thank you all.
Hands and all of that, that's just dizzying to me. I would just.
Yeah.
shut that right off.
Extremely normal. Yeah, extremely normal. Yeah, and in this case, the videos are really long, and some, like, they're often kind of built into her routines, right? Some of the most popular types of videos on TikTok are get ready with me videos, right? Where people, are recording while they're going through like their morning routine, whether it's often, women doing makeup or people trying on outfits for the day or whatever. And those videos are extensive, right? And people get a lot of following just on that. And so this is a kind of riff on that, right? Where a lot of the videos are her just talking about what's in the paper in the Sunday Times that day and talking about interesting things. But a lot of them are integrating that with her everyday life, right? So sometimes she's eating breakfast, other times like she's in Central Park, right? Because she lives in New York, I believe. So that kind of disarming, I'm an everyday person, you're seeing me in my everyday life. That type of video, again, back to your comment, is what the primary audience or user of this platform likes, right? They like something that feels well polished, but not too polished. They like something that feels authentic and real in a way that, a 2-minute segment from the NBC primetime news, that just seems like overproduced nothing. Like they don't pay attention to that, right? So I find that, you see the generational dynamics and what people think is going to be popular. Yeah.
All right, so going back to the demographics.
Yeah.
With the big bar charts and for people in their 20s. So there's this enormous group of potential voters, right?
Yeah.
People maybe that don't vote.
Yeah.
So how do the politicians use this to get those thousands of people to vote for them?
Yeah. And, so most of the politicians have accounts on TikTok, right? And they're posting different types of videos, right? Some of them are like reposts of things that they're putting elsewhere on social media, campaign ads, that sort of thing. Some of them are this, kind of meme type content, right? There was at the same time, for instance, to show the interesting ambivalence here, at the same time that Biden was saying publicly that he would sign the TikTok ban, he ultimately did. But when he was going through Congress, he said, if it comes to my desk, I'll sign it. At the same time that was happening, he joined TikTok, right? So like there's a really weird ambivalence for, we should get rid of this. It's dangerous. But I know that there are people, between the ages of 8 and 30 who use this so heavily, and a large chunk of them are potential voters. And so I need to be there, right? So that is a really interesting dynamic, but they're using it in different ways. I mean, you can see, we can do a quick, we've got it pulled up here, so I'll just do a quick search. So if you go, so many different accounts. So this is like the kind of campaign account. And you can see that this is the one not just run, well, none of them are run by Joe, obviously. But this is like from his team. And some of these are videos about things specifically that Biden is doing that are positive. A lot of them are, you know, footage of things happening related to Trump, since that's, you know, obviously going to be the breakdown. I'm trying to see, I wonder why it's not just coming up his individual account. You can see though, all of the ones that are, you know, pretending to be Joe Biden, and let's see here. The Trump campaign has a TikTok as well, of course. Whoops, I cannot type. Yeah, that's interesting. Weird. No, why it's not coming up? So you can see, here's a story from April about how he signed this bill, but he, you know, wants to be on TikTok. Okay, it is the Biden HQ. So the one we were looking at is his main account. But so a lot of those videos are not from him, but there are occasional ones that are updated that include just him talking directly to the camera, right? So the one that he did was right around the Super Bowl when he was talking about various things related to like Travis Kelce or Taylor Swift and Mama Kelce, all that stuff, right? So a real effort to be like, I'm normal, right? But then a lot of them are like, here's Biden was on Howard Stern recently, which I have already forgotten about, right? So all sorts of different types of videos trying to reach different types of audience. Some of them are just newsy videos. Some of them are directly talking to the camera, like a campaign ad. Some of them are, you know, clips from the correspondence dinner, which was last month. So a lot of different things there. Any other thoughts, questions? Well, thank you all, folks. I appreciate you coming out, and this video will be on the library's YouTube page, and we'll have another session next month.
Yes, on bias in the news.
Thank you.
How to recognize-
Yes, I was trying to remember the topic. Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about bias related to news and how we can, you know, kind of walk through that and what bias actually means, and it means a lot of different things. So thank you all so much. Thanks for coming out, and I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Yeah, if you want some tacos next time, feel free to register so we know how many to get. And there's